Most people think they understand the stories behind the Conjuring Universe. Haunted houses, possessed dolls, dark entities hiding in old basements and abandoned rooms. But the unsettling truth is that many of the cases that inspired those stories were not originally treated as supernatural at all. In fact, several investigators believed something far more disturbing was happening. Something rooted in human psychology, manipulation, and the fragile line between belief and fear. Because when you look closely at the real files connected to the cases that inspired these stories, the question stops being, were these demons real? And becomes something much harder to answer. Why did so many ordinary families from different places and different years describe nearly identical experiences before any movies, books, or media ever connected them? And why did some investigators walk away from those homes convinced that something deeply wrong had happened, even if they couldn't explain what? The Conjuring Universe turned these stories into cinematic horror, but behind the dramatic music and shadows were real families, real investigators, and real reports that still exist today. Some of them read less like ghost stories, and more like case files from something we still don't fully understand. If you enjoy real-life horror deep dives like this, make sure you resubscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the deeper you look into cases like these, the stranger they start to feel. Most people first encounter these stories through the famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. Throughout the 1960s, 70 segundos and 80s, the Warrens documented hundreds of alleged hauntings across the United States. Their work inspired some of the most recognizable horror stories ever told. But what often gets lost in the retellings is how strangely ordinary many of these cases began. Take the one that eventually inspired the story of the Annabelle doll. In the early 1970s, two nursing students living in an apartment reportedly received a Raggedy Ann doll as a gift. According to their account, small things started happening around the apartment. The doll appeared to change positions when they weren't home. Notes written on parchment paper appeared in rooms where neither woman had left them. At first, they assumed someone was playing a prank. Friends came over and joked about the doll. One of them even tossed it across the room in frustration after claiming it had somehow moved closer to him while he was sleeping. It would have been easy to dismiss the entire situation as exaggeration or stress. College students. Long hours. Shared living space. Small misunderstandings that grow into bigger stories. But what makes the original reports unsettling isn't the doll itself. It's the pattern. Multiple visitors to the apartment later described feeling uncomfortable in the same specific corner of the room. Not frightened, exactly. Just uneasy in a way they couldn't explain. One visitor wrote in a personal journal that the feeling reminded him of being watched. That detail appears again and again in older case notes connected to alleged haunt. A vague sense of observation. A persistent feeling that someone else is present, even when logic says otherwise. Psychologists have studied this sensation for years. In certain environments, especially quiet or isolated spaces, the human brain can become hyper-aware of subtle cues, shadows, sounds, movements that might normally go unnoticed. Our minds start filling in gaps. And sometimes, those gaps become stories. But the Annabelle case wasn't the only one that followed this pattern. Another story that later inspired part of the Conjuring Universe began with the Perron family in Rhode Island during the early 1970s. They had moved into an old farmhouse that, on paper, looked completely normal. The property had a long history, stretching back nearly 2 centuries. Several families had lived there. Some had died there, which wasn't unusual for houses built in the 1800s. But soon after moving in, the Perron family began noticing small, persistent details. Doors opening on their own. Objects moving from one room to another. The faint sound of footsteps late at night. Again, none of this immediately suggested anything supernatural. Old houses settle. Wooden floors shift. Pipes knock against the walls. When temperatures change, anyone who has lived in an older home understands how easily strange noises can be explained away. What made the Perron case different was how many family members independently described the same experiences. One daughter reported hearing someone whisper her name when no one else was in the room. Another claimed she woke up several nights in a row to the feeling that someone was standing beside her bed. Their parents initially assumed the girls were scaring each other. Bateau Bear. Time the reports kept aligning. Even visitors began mentioning unusual feelings in certain rooms of the house. The Warrens eventually became involved in the case, and their interpretation leaned toward the paranormal. But even some investigators who reviewed the situation later offered a more grounded possibility. Expectation. Once people believe a location might be haunted, their perception changes. Normal sounds become suspicious. Coincidences start forming patterns. Human beings are exceptionally good at building narratives from incomplete information. But then there are the cases that resist easy explanations. One example often discussed by researchers involves what later inspired the figure known as the nun in the Conjuring Universe. Long before that character appeared on movie screens, investigators reviewing religious hauntings noticed a recurring theme in witness reports. Several individuals described seeing dark, human-like figures wearing clothing that resembled religious garments. Not just once or twice, but across different locations and different decades. Skeptics argue that cultural imagery plays a powerful role in shaping hallucinations or misinterpretations. If someone grows up surrounded by religious symbols, their mind may naturally interpret ambiguous shapes as familiar figures. A shadow becomes a person. A person becomes something more symbolic. Yet what makes these reports unsettling is how similar they often are. Descriptions of tall figures standing silently in doorways. Witnesses reporting that the figure doesn't move, doesn't speak, and disappears when someone else enters the room. Sleep researchers point out that these experiences closely resemble sleep paralysis events, where individuals briefly wake up while their body remains immobilized. During these episodes, the brain can generate extremely vivid figures in the room. To the person experiencing it, the presence feels completely real. And once someone believes they've seen something impossible, that belief can reshape every future memory connected to the place. The mind doesn't just recall events, it rewrites them. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the Conjuring Universe's real-world inspiration isn't a specific entity or figure. It's the consistency across dozens of cases. Families describe similar emotional progressions. First comes confusion, strange noises, small incidents that feel easily explainable. Then comes unease, objects appearing in the wrong place, the feeling of being watched. The quiet realization that everyone in the house is noticing something. Finally comes fear. Not always because of what actually happens, but because of what people start imagining might happen next. Investigators who have studied alleged hauntings often note that the environment itself becomes psychologically charged. Once fear enters the house, every shadow feels heavier. Every silence lasts a little longer, and that atmosphere can affect everyone inside it. Children become more sensitive to noises. Adults lose sleep trying to rationalize what's happening. Before we continue, let's pick up exactly where we left off. All the people, their appearances, clothing, ages, and expressions are exactly the same as before. The house is exactly as it was in the previous investigation, with the same rooms, furniture, and objects in the same positions. The doll remains on the same spot where it was last seen. Nothing has changed. This is the same environment, the same family, the same investigation continuing seamlessly. Over time, the house itself starts to feel different. Not because anything supernatural is necessarily occurring, but because belief has changed how people experience the space around them. Some psychologists call this environmental suggestion. When multiple people share a belief about a location, their perceptions slowly synchronize. If one person hears footsteps, another might begin listening for them too. If someone claims an object moved, others may start paying closer attention to where objects are placed. Small misunderstandings can snowball into something far more complicated. And yet, even with all these explanations, certain details still linger. Some investigators who reviewed these historical cases noted moments where witnesses described information they seemingly shouldn't have known. Private family events mentioned by strangers. Objects moved to locations that multiple people insisted had been checked minutes earlier. These are the moments that keep the stories alive decades later. Not because they prove anything supernatural happened, but because they leave just enough doubt to keep people wondering. And doubt can be powerful. If you've ever stayed alone in a quiet house, late at night, you know how quickly the mind starts filling empty spaces with possibilities. A creaking floorboard, a soft knock somewhere in the walls. The feeling that something just moved in the corner of your vision. Most of the time, it's nothing. But occasionally, the experience lingers long enough to make you question what you actually saw. Stories like the ones that inspired the Conjuring Universe sit right at the intersection of those feelings. They're not just about ghosts or demons. They're about the way fear spreads between people, the way belief shapes perception, and the uncomfortable possibility that sometimes we can't fully separate what happened from what we believed was happening. That uncertainty is part of why these stories continue to resonate decades later. Not because they prove the supernatural exists, but because they reveal something deeper about how human beings process fear, memory, and the unknown. And if you've ever watched one of those movies and felt a strange chill long after it ended, you're not alone. Send this video to someone who grew up watching horror movies with you. Ask them which story stuck with them the most. Because once you start looking into the real accounts behind these cases, the line between fiction and reality becomes harder to see. Not clearer, just more complicated. Even today, investigators who study alleged hauntings often avoid dramatic conclusions. Most agree that many cases can be explained through environmental factors, psychological stress, or simple misunderstanding. But they also admit that not every detail fits neatly into those explanations. Sometimes the records end abruptly. Witnesses move away. Families stop talking about what happened, and the house returns to being just another house, which leaves us with a final, uncomfortable question. If dozens of families over the years described similar feelings of being watched, similar unexplained disturbances, similar moments of quiet dread, were they all simply imagining the same thing? Or were they experiencing something real, but misunderstood? That's the part no movie ever fully answers. And maybe that's why these stories never truly fade away. So now I'm curious, what do you think? Do you believe the real cases behind the Conjuring Universe were simply misunderstood psychology and coincidence? Or do you think something else might have been happening inside those houses? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read them all.